2 weeks ago, I was in a team meeting. There was about 8 people on a call, and I spent 10 minutes using the invitation ladder to get this guy named Bob to finally speak up. He'd been silent the entire meeting, and I finally got him to share an idea, but it was completely off base. Like, not just unhelpful. It was in the exact opposite direction that we'd been moving for the last 3 months. And my brain immediately went to, oh my god, Bob, we already tried that. Like, that's not gonna work with our timeline. But I caught myself because I knew that saying that would have shut down Bob permanently, and that would have told everyone else that speaking up is risky. Instead, I used something called the bridge response. 3 sentences, 30 seconds, Bob stayed engaged, and 20 minutes later, he contributed to the idea that solved my problem. Because here's what most people get wrong. They think their job is to accept or reject ideas. It's not. You're not here to play Judge Judy, folks. Your job is to keep the people in the conversation long enough to get to the good stuff. And here's how. Remember last time you learned the invitation ladder and you used it. You said what you saw with an observation prompt, and then you asked how they felt with a reaction invitation, and then you steered the conversation forward using a directional prompt. Finally, somebody in your meeting spoke up, and I'm sure their idea was completely off topic. Like, they're suggesting something ridiculous, like, let's add 6 months to the timeline when you know the execs want it done in 6 weeks. In either case, yours or mine, completely misses the point of what we're trying to solve. And in that moment, every instinct in your body screams to shut them down and get them back on track. And so you say something along the lines of, guys, Bob, that's not gonna work. Or, we already tried that. Or maybe you try to be polite and you soften that with corporate speak, like, that's outside the scope of what we're discussing. Or let's stay focused on the actual problem. Blah, 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 man. They're all versions of the same thing, which is thanks, but no. And the room goes quiet. Not thinking quiet, scared quiet. There were probably 3 people in your meeting that were about to speak. Instead, they probably just closed their laptops a little, adjusted their posture, and suddenly, everyone's very interested in their notes. And I'll tell you why. It's because of what they just learned, and that is, speaking up is risky. And if my idea isn't perfect, I'm gonna get corrected in front of everyone. So here's what the research shows. Harvard professor Amy Edmondson, is she related to Edmondson? Anyways, she spent 20 years studying psychological safety in teams, 20! And she found that when someone offers an idea and gets immediately dismissed, it takes an average of 7 positive interactions to rebuild the willingness to share again. 7 positive interactions. Man, most meetings don't even have a total of 7 interactions at all. You're not gonna be chatting with this person 7 more times, especially if you dismiss them like that. So that person is done, not just for today, maybe for weeks. And depending on how you talk to them, maybe even permanent. So here's what you do instead. It's called the bridge response. And you don't accept their idea, you don't reject their idea. What you do is you bridge it from their contribution to something useful. You keep them in the conversation long enough to get to the good stuff. It takes you 3 parts, 30 seconds, and it changes everything. And so here's how the bridge response works. Part 1, validate the person, not the idea. The person. People. You're acknowledging the fact that they took a risk to share with the group. You're gonna now separate the person from the idea. And here's what it sounds like. Let's say in your meeting, you got a suggestion to speed up the project by cutting our extra testers and making the testing period shorter. Now you could say something like, okay, I hear you're prioritizing speed, and that makes sense, given the timeline pressures that we're under. Or you could also address the fact that I appreciate you thinking about cost, and that's been a theme today. Notice how you're not saying good idea, or you're not saying let's do that. You're acknowledging what they care about, which is speed, cost, efficiency, whatever it took to drive their contribution to you. But here's where you're gonna be tempted to stop. All right, you're gonna validate that, and then you're immediately gonna pivot to someone else, or you're just gonna move on entirely. And that person who just spoke, they feel like they weren't taken seriously. Like you gave them a participation trophy. Like, hey, thanks for trying, bud. Anyways, let's get back to the real conversation. That's almost as worse as just shutting them down, because now they know that you were just being polite. You didn't take their idea seriously. You just pretended to listen. And that's why you need part 2, which is to find the golden nugget. Every contribution, even the most unhelpful ones, it has something useful buried in it. And it's your job to find it, name it out loud. Now, here's Bob's example from my team meeting. right? So Bob suggested that we pilot a new system that we're launching with our nearest client first, right? The problem was our nearest client is also our biggest client. So terrible pilot candidate. But here's what I said instead. I said, I hear you wanting to test this closer to where we are before rolling it out broadly. That's smart. We don't want to risk our locations further away if you can't hop in quickly. Notice how I didn't say, let's do that. I found something that was useful about his thinking, which was the desire to test in an environment closer to us before we do further locations, which is the awareness of the risk, and I named it. MIT research on collective intelligence found that groups perform best when they feel safe contributing. And that safety comes from how you respond when the ideas aren't perfect. Because when you validate what's useful, even in an off-topic idea, those people stay engaged instead of shut down. Because Bob now knows that while his specific idea wasn't right, he knows his instinct was right. And that tells him he's going in the right direction. Okay, quick thing folks. Last video, I showed you the invitation ladder. 3 questions to get silent people talking. If you haven't watched that yet, there's a perfect setup for this sort of conversation. The link's gonna be in the description. Now let's move on to part 3, which is the bridge response, which is redirect forward. All right, so now you're gonna take that nugget that you found in part 2, and you're gonna use it to move the conversation towards becoming more productive. You're not staying with their original idea, but you are using what was useful about it and pivot that to the group. So here's what I said to Bob next. So the question becomes, Bob, how do we test this in a way that allows us to be closer to the site if something goes sideways? Like, what does a low risk pilot look like, everyone? I used the nugget, if you noticed. I said closer to the site, low risk, to ask a question that moves the entire group forward. And I didn't say, here's what we should do instead. I simply redirected the question. So now I'm inviting the entire group, including Bob, to help problem solve together. And I know this is where you're gonna get nervous. You're gonna think, well, Shahmeran, what if I can't find a nugget? What if their idea is completely useless? Here's the truth. There's always a nugget. Always. And even if someone says completely off the wall, there's a reason they said it. Maybe they're worried about something. Maybe they're trying to solve a problem you haven't acknowledged yet. Your job isn't to agree with them. It's to figure out what they're actually trying to solve or what they're worried about. Then you name it and you redirect it. I mean, worst case scenario, the nugget is just gonna be, you're thinking about this problem, and that's still useful. You can use this sort of framework to answer when you really can't find it. I appreciate you trying to solve for X, The constraint we're actually dealing with is Y. Or you could say something like, so the question becomes, how do we address X given Y? Done. It's simple to just validate them. And that's what you did, right? You named what they're trying to solve. You redirected what they're trying to solve to the real constraint that you had. It took you 30 seconds, all right? Here's what it looks like in practice. I'll give you the full bridge response, all 3 parts together in 30 seconds. And I'll use Bob's scenario. So Bob says, why don't we pilot with our closest location first? So I say, okay, I hear you're prioritizing testing before a full rollout. That makes sense given the risk here. The smart thing that you're getting at is that we need a controlled environment where we can learn while being close to location in case we need to jump on in. So the question becomes, everyone, what would a low risk pilot look like for us and who is the right test partner? It took me 30 seconds to say that, and Bob stayed engaged. And now the group starts talking together, they're problem solving. And 20 minutes into that conversation, Bob was the one who found out that we have a mid-sized location about 30 minutes away, and they've been asking for early access. Perfect pilot candidates. And that's the bridge response, folks. You don't have to accept every idea, or you don't reject every imperfect idea. You keep people in the conversation long enough to get to the good stuff. Validate the person, find the nugget, and redirect forward. So let me recap. When someone finally speaks up but what they said isn't helpful, you always have 3 options. Option number 1, shut them down with a that won't work. It's fast, efficient, and it kills participation. You've got option number 2. Dismiss them with like a, ooh, thanks for your thought, man. It's hollow, kills trust. Please don't do this one. And then you've got option number 3, which is the bridge response, all right? You validate the person, you find the golden nugget, and you redirect forward. It keeps everyone engaged, and it gets you to better ideas. Remember, Bob wasn't wrong to suggest the closest client, he just didn't have all the context. But his instinct was right, and it was close to minimize risk. The bridge response kept him long enough in the game to share his idea with what actually worked. Because your job as a facilitator isn't to be right, it's to help the group get to right. And in my next video, we'll talk about what to do when one person hijacks the meeting and turns it into their personal TED Talk, because you can't use the invitation ladder if the conversation has been taken hostage by one voice. The link's gonna be in the description when it's live. Until next time, have a wonderful day, folks, and I'll see you in the next one.